Hello everyone, today we are continuing with Goblet of Fire, chapters 18 through 24. So, in my last video I was critical of Hermione's white savior approach to house elves, and I stand by that analysis. But a lot of you pointed out in class that this is really the beginning of Hermione's development as a young activist. And while as a narrative, having an oppressed group of people, or house elves, serve as a vehicle for the personal growth of a more privileged protagonist is a tired and problematic trope, there is no denying that we do see Hermione grow and learn from her experiences with SPEW and take some of those lessons into the DA in the next book. Even in the chapters that we read for today, we see Hermione actually going down to the Hogwarts kitchen and meeting some of the house elves. And yes, she definitely has an agenda, but this is a baby step closer to a form of activism that happens in community and centers those who are most affected. So don't worry, I'm not canceling Hermione for her imperfect allyship. She is 14 years old and she is learning. But I'm more interested in what function that representation has in the text and how it fits into the bigger tangle of messages that we get about slavery and supremacy in these books. One of the hosts of the Witch Please podcast, Hannah McGregor, has said that she loves Hermione so much that when Hermione does something dumb or problematic, she doesn't blame Hermione, she blames the author. Which I think gets at this larger issue that we're addressing this semester of being able to see the author kind of peeking through the text and trying to sort out what is a character as seen through Harry's eyes, and what is a character as described by J.K. Rowling. The descriptions of Dudley are a good example of this, and I think we have another excellent example in these chapters with Rita Skeeter. So the first time that I read these books, I took Rita Skeeter absolutely at face value. She was a character in a book, and she existed in that world exactly as she was described by the text. In my later rereads, I read Rita Skeeter with this awareness that I was getting Harry's perspective, and I noticed the focus on physical details that were negative, like gold teeth and clawed fingers, that signaled Harry's increasing dislike of Rita more than anything else. And this time through, I was most struck by physical details like large mannish hands, heavy-jawed face, thick fingers, and surprisingly strong grip. That really seemed to come more from Rowling and her preoccupation with gender binary than they do from Harry. And I should mention here that some readers have raised the question of whether Rowling is hinting that Rita Skeeter is a trans woman, with later revelations about Rita seeming to support that theory, at least as we might expect Rowling to express it in metaphor. But my main point is that as easy as it is to dive into this world and become lost in the story, which I'm definitely not criticizing, that is one of the main points of fantasy, simultaneously there are a lot of layers here, which is especially interesting to consider in a series in which characters are so often pretending to be someone else and the extra layers that adds. But before I start giving away spoilers, I want to spend some more time on Hermione as she appears in these chapters. I think there's a lot that's interesting going on, and some of it's obvious, but yeah, I would be remiss if I didn't mention it. So let's start with the ways in which Hermione stands up to powerful people. One of your reading response questions asked about the gendered ways that we see anger in these chapters, so I'm not going to get super specific there, but generally speaking, Harry and Ron are angry at each other in these chapters, and also at Cedric and Krum, respectively, as a result of jealousy and these sort of teenage notions of masculinity. Since Harry's our narrator, we are treated to several of his violent fantasies toward various other men and boys. But Hermione, on the other hand, she's angry with Ron, which we'll get to, but most of the time when Hermione's angry, it's at people with power or authority who are mistreating others. And importantly, Hermione's ready to stand up to those people, which is a huge contrast to the Hermione of books 1 and 2, especially, who always deferred to adults in authority. So we saw this side of her already in the Dark Mark chapter, when she defended Winky against Mr. Crouch. She actually yells at Mr. Crouch, and she continues to rail against him and the other enslavers of house elves throughout this book. And Hermione does this again in these chapters at the Three Broomsticks. Again, after Rita Skeeter has published a story about Hagrid, she calls Rita a horrible woman who'd do anything for a story. What's especially interesting to me here is actually Rita's response. She says, "Sit down, you silly little girl, and don't talk about things you don't understand." So what I notice is that that's a clear echo of what Snape shouted at Hermione in the Shrieking Shack back in book 3. He said, "Keep quiet, you stupid girl. Don't talk about what you don't understand." And of course, we can't be sure if this repetition is intentional, but it points me to the idea of Snape as sort of the original authority figure who's abusive and dismissive and shows Hermione that not all authority figures deserve her respect and deference. So maybe Snape has a teaching function after all. But Hermione's more critical response to authority is also related to her development as a reader, which I pointed to in Book 2. So one example is the Daily Prophet. We know that Hermione has been reading it since she started at Hogwarts. She wants to know what's going on in the magical world. She even had it delivered to her parents' house and to her vacation spot in France during the summer. But now that Rita's columns are featuring people that she knows, Hermione's starting to recognize the possibility of bias and agenda in this writing. Similarly, Hermione's beloved Hogwarts: A History, which she's quoted from at least a dozen times so far in the series, in all of its 1,000 pages, the book doesn't mention the house elves at Hogwarts, which prompts Hermione to suggest that the book should really be titled A Highly Biased and Selective History of Hogwarts, which glosses over the nastier aspects of the school. So we're still going to see Hermione heading to the library, because she still recognizes that there's knowledge to gain from books. But if you think about the FWIL courses, the Foundational Writing and Information Literacy courses that we teach at UVM, when we talk about critical reading, we think about bias and agenda, about what is the text's audience, purpose, and tone. And that's exactly what Hermione is doing now. She's becoming a critical reader. We're also going to see Hermione continuing to cite written authorities in conversation, because unfortunately a lot of people still see her as a, quote, silly little girl. So she has to be ready to back up everything she says with sources. Which is a good habit in general, but I think we can see why Hermione in particular, as a Muggle-born girl, is going to see this as really essential. We've talked a little bit about how Hermione is, in general, a much better friend to Harry and Ron than they are to her. But I want to touch a little bit on the gendered caretaking that she does in this book. So first, there's the basic mothering behaviors that we see throughout the series. So Hermione checks the boys' homework, she reminds them to study, and in these chapters, she nags Harry about how he's coming with figuring out the tasks for the Triwizard Tournament, to the point that he's actually annoyed with her. I also noticed that she serves Harry and Ron their food onto their plates in the Great Hall, which is just this little detail that I've never seen reciprocated. They'd never do that for her. We also get the feeling, even from Harry's point of view, that Hermione's expending a fair amount of emotional energy as the go-between between Ron and Harry when they're angry with each other and fighting. She literally explains Ron's feelings to Harry, and I think that we can assume that she does that vice versa for explaining Harry's feelings to Ron. She listens to their complaints and their excuses, and she repeatedly encourages them to talk and make up. I think it's also worth noting that in these interactions with Harry, Hermione never shows, or at least Harry never notices, any jealousy toward him. Everything that Hermione says about Ron, always being in Harry's shadow, could be equally true of Hermione. But unlike Ron, Hermione actually works extremely hard. She is the champion of growth mindset in these books. Case in point, when Harry needs to learn the summoning spell by tomorrow, he desperately turns to Hermione, like she's going to have some kind of instant fix. Instead, she takes him to an empty classroom and she makes him practice, because that's what Hermione does. But when she leaves to go to class, Harry stops, because he figures there's no point without Hermione. Harry practices when there's an audience. The Quidditch team, a teacher, Hermione. But Hermione keeps working, keeps practicing, keeps studying, even when it's just her alone in the library. So the fact that it's always Harry who's the hero, in spite of the fact that Hermione is so hardworking and driven that she literally time travels to attend more classes and improve her abilities, not only suggests some sexism, but I think also calls into question this idea that choices matter more in these books than inborn traits or destiny. But I'm digressing a little bit, so one last thing, I want to talk about Hermione's appearance. So in these chapters, Ron finally notices that Hermione is a girl, in a not terribly smooth kind of way. But to be fair, this is also the book in which everyone simultaneously notices that other people are boys or girls or whatever. Well, not whatever, because this is J.K. Rowling, so it really is a binary, boys or girls. But the sudden onset of pubescence and the accompanying sort of narrative attention to crushes and flirting and attraction is clearly a result of Harry's perspective. But I wonder how much that explains the emphasis on Hermione's appearance in these chapters, which is really quite striking, and as far as we know, Harry himself doesn't have feelings for Hermione. But it starts when Harry and Draco are fighting in the hall, and Draco's spell hits Hermione and makes her teeth grow. And her front teeth have always been on the large side, but this spell grows them down like past her collar. So Hermione's mortified, but Snape, being an awful and completely inappropriate teacher, says, "Oh, I see no difference." Later, we're told that when Madame Pomfrey shrunk these teeth back down, Hermione let her keep going until they were smaller than they actually had been originally. Ron also suggests that her teeth are straighter, at which point we find out that Hermione's apparently had braces this whole time, but now her teeth are magically perfect. And that's all relatively neutral, I guess. She's kind of sped up the braces process with magic, and it seems to have increased her confidence. But what gets my attention is the reactions from other characters. First, Rita Skeeter describes Hermione as stunningly pretty in the Daily Prophet feature on Harry, which is the kind of description that we've never seen about Hermione before. I don't think she's even been described as moderately pretty. It's always big teeth, bushy hair. Interestingly, Rita Skeeter herself later makes a snide remark about Hermione's bushy hair when Hermione stands up to her. But the big moment is the Yule Ball. So we read in Harry Potter and Beyond that Harry's narrative, especially in the first book, really tracks with the Cinderella story, but it's Hermione who has the Cinderella moment here, also known as the geeky girl glow-up montage that's featured in like half the teen movies of the 1990s. So it does fit here in this book. But we start with Ron unable to believe that Hermione's going to need 3 hours to get ready, and he makes one last attempt to find out who her date is. In contrast, the boys go up to change an hour before the ball, and Ron kind of like mutilates his emasculating dress robes a little bit, which really doesn't impress his date, Padma, who, like Hermione, is actually making an effort. Then, when Harry first spots Hermione, he doesn't even recognize her. He describes her as, quote, a pretty girl in blue robes Harry didn't know. When he finally recognizes that it's her, the text tells us that his jaw dropped, and she didn't look like Hermione at all. She's wearing a gown, and again, Harry really notices her smaller teeth. She's also straightened her hair, and presumably one of the other girls has styled it, though it's not Poverty, because she's staring at Hermione in unflattering disbelief. We get some more description of the girls who fancy Victor Crumb, looking at Hermione with loathing and jealousy, and Ron still not recognizing her for a few more paragraphs, at which point he notices and starts looking at Crumb with loathing and jealousy, so that it's pretty clear what's going on here. And in case it's still not clear, Ron picks a fight with Hermione about her going to the ball with Crumb. So plot-wise, all of this focus on Hermione's appearance is in the service of this moment, in which it combines with her going to the ball with Victor to bring out Ron's jealousy and maybe clarify for him his feelings for Hermione. But I question both whether it's necessary and again what the message is meant to be here. Why does Ron realize that he likes Hermione at the moment when she didn't look like Hermione at all? When she's erased the two physical features that have been used throughout these books to describe her, the bushy hair and the big teeth. And the text has spotlighted her appearance above the other main feature that's used to describe her, which is that she's very smart. Why is that the moment? So, that's all from me for now. I look forward to hearing your thoughts.